Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. I'm your host, Paul F. Austin, and today I'm speaking with Alli Schaper, the co-founder of SuperMush, as well as the co-founder of the Microdosing Collective. And Alli and I are venturing into the fascinating intersection of functional mushrooms, microdosing, and societal change. Now, a few years ago, Alli and I had a meeting at the Butcher's Daughter in Venice, California. She sat down and said, Paul, I think we need to start a nonprofit around microdosing. And now, nearly 3 years later, the Microdosing Collective has been birthed. We've talked to policy changes in Sacramento. We've thrown a number of parties to cultivate an incredible community. We've even started to do a little bit of research on microdosing for cluster headaches. And so I wanted to bring Alli onto the show to talk about our work at the Microdosing Collective, as well as everything else she's up to with wellness, functional mushrooms, mental health, and societal change. So you hear us discuss the importance of consumer protection in the underground market, how we envision making microdosing more legally accessible. We go into the reason why. Why are we doing all of this work in the first place? This is a very rich conversation. I always love it when I get to sit down with a good friend on the podcast because we already know each other so well. And so we're able to dive in that much deeper. And so you'll see that on this episode. Now, here's a little bit more about Alli. Alli Schaper is the CEO and co-founder of SuperMush. Her mission is to rebrand functional mushrooms and encourage collaboration within the psychedelic industry. So we talk about Alli's journey from corporate America to psychedelic advocacy, the birth and mission of the Microdosing Collective, challenges and experiences in psychedelic policy reform, the importance of consumer protection in the underground psychedelic market, our vision for legal microdosing access and its potential societal impact, and the power of personal stories in advancing psychedelic policy. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into our conversation today with Alli Schaper. Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. We have a special episode today. I'm here live with Alli Schaper at her home in Venice. Alli is a collaborator and co-founder of the Microdosing Collective, which we'll talk a lot about today, but her main project is SuperMush, an LA-based mental wellness lifestyle brand. Alli is a speaker, entrepreneur, podcast host, educator, and community builder. She's been featured in Forbes 30 Under 30, National Geographic, Summit Series, Bloomberg, Rolling Stone, Goop, and a lot of other publications. And this podcast has really been a long time coming. Alli and I have been working on the Microdosing Collective since late 2021, almost 3 years now is when we birthed the idea here in Venice. And so I wanted to bring her on, first of all, to hear more about her story and what has her so committed to mushrooms, both functional and psychedelic, but also for us to flesh out a little bit more about what we're doing with the Microdosing Collective and why we think it's so critical for accessibility for these psychedelic medicines on a cultural level. So Alli, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
I am honored. I've been waiting for years to be invited on Paul Austin's podcast. So this is a really big moment for me.
The Psychedelic Podcast. So, when we were chatting a little bit before coming in today, I had sent you sort of a few high-level items that I wanted to talk about. And the Microdosing Collective, I definitely want to get into that. But the first thing I want to start with is, a lot of what you've been talking about lately is this relationship between death and mushrooms. And not to just jump right into it, but I do think it's a beautiful way to tell a little bit more about your personal story, about what has you so committed to this work. And so I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about why are you talking so publicly about death and mushrooms? What is it about that topic that has you so curious and interested? And why do you think it's important as a topic to amplify?
I love starting with this. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. It's interesting because you can always connect the dots backwards, right? Never necessarily looking forward. And I have been so deeply passionate about mushrooms and fungi, and all of my work revolves around that passion. And when my dad passed away 2 years ago, it gave a deeper meaning to everything that I'm working on because I was able to reflect on our culture's relationship with death in a way that felt more personal to me. And it really sparked a light bulb, I guess, that I hadn't reflected on in this way where, I like to talk about mushrooms have been my greatest teacher and they've taught me so many lessons, but the most important one has been looking at the way that mushrooms have a beautiful relationship with death in a complete paradox of how our Western world views death and dying. And because I've been so immersed in the world of psychedelics and have been on my spiritual journey, I had a really beautiful experience coupled with a ton of grief around my dad's passing. But it was in such a juxtaposition to the way that the Western world views and processes death. And so I kind of had my own spiritual experience inside of this Western funeral and death process. And it kind of spun me out in looking at, if you just take this at, face value, how do mushrooms handle death? Fungi eat things that die. Mm-hmm. And so when something dies on the forest floor, fungi will come out and consume it and return its nutrients to the earth, to the microbiome of the soil. And this beautiful symbiotic relationship. And if you look at Eastern cultures and the way that they process death, it's in a lot of ways a celebration. It's in a lot of ways a, memorial and testament to that person's life. And it's integrated in a way that our Western world, at least in my experience, this isn't always the case. There's, there's nuances to this conversation, but, we put bodies in boxes and we freeze them and we put them in the earth and we interrupt that process so mushrooms can't actually eat them. So I just think there's this beautiful relationship that mushrooms have with death. There's so much that we can learn from it. And it gave a deeper meaning and a deeper, I guess, connection with me for the wisdom of fungi, in addition to all of the other things that I've learned from them.
And what have you personally learned about death through, let's say, like working with mushrooms in particular, like psychedelic mushrooms? How have those experiences helped you to maybe better understand what that means or what that is, or why it happens, or, even where we go, if we go anywhere? What's sort of been that insight that's come through from your experiences?
So the framing for this that I'd like to give, or context, is, we're in a world where, especially, we're sitting in the centerfold of it, right? We're sitting in Venice, California, and we're trying to extend our life. So much of culture and the wellness industry and the biohacking space is all about the extension of life. And even more so now, there's, people on the internet that are talking about purely avoiding death altogether. Like
Brian Johnson, who lives here in Venice, who has also been a guest on the podcast before, and he has this phrase, "Don't die," that he's working to really amplify.
Yeah, and he's an interesting avatar for this. So just to look at, whether it's him or anyone else that's really living with a primary focus on avoidance of death. And then you have the complete other side of that, where looking at death in a beautiful way and having acceptance of it and integrating it into your experience of life is actually one of the things that I believe we can do to feel more alive. And so the fear of death, in fact, might be killing us quicker. If you look at how, so much of our world and what we talk about and what you coach people on with microdosing is around nervous system regulation and bringing the body into coherence with nature. But if you're in any sort of state of fear of anything, doesn't matter if it's death or love or intimacy, your body's constricted. And I realized I made this short list for myself after my dad passed away. And I was like, what are the things that wake us up to the reality of our own mortality? And my short list was, one, you die before you die, often induced by ego death, often induced by a psychedelic experience, not always. You can experience that through other modalities, not just psychedelics. Two is you have a near-death experience. So you actually flatline. And there's all these crazy stories. I went in a little bit of a rabbit hole on the internet around people with NDE, near-death experiences, and what that was like for them. And it changes their life in a pretty dramatic way. And then the third is that someone that you love really dearly dies suddenly. And all three of these scenarios seem to create a pretty dramatic life change for the person that experienced them. The difference with the third is that you have a physical absence of someone that was in your day-to-day experience of life. So, all of these you ideally escape without being permanently scathed physically. You're emotionally and spiritually awakened in best case scenario, but the third is more permanent. Right. It's a permanent psyche shift. And often all we want when that happens is to have all you want is time with that person. So it changes your perspective in a way that I think is really beautiful. And even though, I was listening to Ram Dass before this podcast, because that's what I do to prepare for a Paul Austin podcast. And a lot of what Ram Dass talks about is like these two planes of existence, right? Where you have your godly interpretation and then your human interpretation. So in no ways do I want to skip the human experience of grief, because I think it's really beautiful and meaningful and hard. But there is, for me, I felt this dramatic shift in my life for things that were conceptual around, oh, that'll happen later, or I can wait to experience this emotion later because we have no idea what's going to happen. My dad had no idea he was going to pass away until the moment that he did.
Right.
And that shook up my psyche in a way that I'm so grateful for. So it's interesting in this world, right, where I'm so passionate about the biohacking space and living well and living longer and all of those things. And also I'm really always wanting to work on integrating a beautiful relationship with my own mortality.
Right. And paradoxically, those seem to go hand in hand. Like when I had a lot of my early psychedelic experiences when I was 19 and 20 with LSD, it really helped me to understand this taboo of death that we hold and how it constricts us so much from really living to our fullest. And so when we're able to actually, like you've talked about so beautifully, whether it's through psychedelics, near-death experiences, or the passing of a loved one, when we're able to actually really experience that fully, there seems to be something that happens on the other side of that where we actually embrace life even more because we realize how much of a miracle and how beautiful it is to exist. So naturally then, there seems to be this really interesting relationship between psychedelics and longevity, because after we experience death fully, we come to realize, oh, life is a miracle. I want to embrace it. I want to live fully. And part of the way that I live fully is by increasing my health span, or health span is probably the best way to phrase it, because then I get to play more in this existence. And I think the more that we can perceive life as something that is playful and fun rather than, like Sisyphus, who's pushing a boulder up a hill for eternity, right? It's a sacrifice, it's a struggle. That shift then allows for us to really sort of imbue ourselves with a love for existence. And that is lacking for the most part, right? It's why religion is so popular, like mainstream religion is so popular, because for most people, life is suffering. I think when we talk about psychedelics and we talk about microdosing, part of the inspiration is, how do we help more people to recognize the sort of miracle of existence and ideally create systems that help people to recognize the beauty of existence, because it's hard for a lot of people. And I don't think it necessarily has to be hard.
Yeah, I think there's two threads that are interesting about what you just shared. One is the practices that we do in our day-to-day life that can help us experience it more fully. And this is a rabbit hole, but the experience that most people, specifically if you're just talking about America, are having of life is very diluted by the substances that we're consuming.
Right.
Everything from pharmaceuticals to, toxins in our food to, plastics that are making their way into our body. Like we're so clouded. Right. Our psyches are so clouded. And so the day-to-day experience of life, all these practices that you're talking about are really the process of connection and removing these layers that have been put on our brains. Because when we have a symptom right now, we're giving people medications to mask the symptom and diluting and making the edges of the human experience and the feelings that we're designed to have not as extreme on either side.
Right.
So zombifying ourselves, so to speak. So and the way that I like to describe this is also inspired by my dad. I wrote this story called Mushrooms Eat Death for Breakfast. And why that analogy was so powerful for me is because we, decide, besides the fact that we are in a fasting culture and now people don't eat breakfast anymore, breakfast is something that happens ideally every day, right? So it's this daily practice. And I think it's really important, at least for me, to remind myself that I'm going to die every single day and to keep coming back to it and keep returning to that. So a mortality practice, whatever you want to call it, or however you want to do it, and incorporating that in addition to all of the other wellness things, movement, nutrition, all those things you described. So I find that really interesting to just throw in the mix. And I think it's going to increasingly be something that people talk about, and inspired by the Brian Johnsons of the world that are pushing this message of anti-death in a big way, will in a lot of ways inspire people to reflect on their own relationship with death. So I think that's really interesting. And then the other thing is, this was in my Ram Dass podcast this morning. He shared that intellect is the source of separateness. And so much of the problems that people are experiencing with their mental health, on one hand, it's coming from the clouding from pharmaceuticals and food toxins and things like that, or lack of social connection. And on the other hand, it's just like a pure idea of separateness. And this sounds so esoteric and so confusing if you haven't actually had an experience of felt oneness with nature or people around you. I remember when someone shared with me, "We are all one," for the first time. I was like, that sounds really stupid. We are clearly not all one. I am in this body, you're in that body. But this state of individualism is just increasing.
Right.
And I'm really inspired by psychedelics for the main reason that they give people a felt sense for often the first time in their entire life of realizing that we're all humans of planet Earth. And the reason why we even started doing this work together around microdosing was under the core question around, what does the world need more of? And it's more open-minded people. It's more of a day-to-day reminder, connection that we are all part of one thing. So microdosing does many things, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think it's really tied into that daily reminder and daily practice of connection, in addition to some mortality practices as well.
So one thing I reflect on, I read this tweet maybe a year ago, which was about high agency people, and how with high agency people, they often sort of buck the conventions of who you think they are, right? And so you are a very high agency person, and probably there's nothing better that describes that than some of the things that you've done prior in your career. Like when we first met, I knew you as someone who had lived in New York. You had, I think, a previous startup that was maybe in the travel and wellness space. You were starting to get into mushrooms and trying to figure out early on how that was all going to pan out. And then you started SuperMush and into the Multiverse and now the Microdosing Collective. And now you're quite a prominent figure at the overlap of mushrooms and wellness and entrepreneurship. But before that, you were a CPA working for, I believe, Deloitte in
Ernst & Young, the competitor.
Working for Ernst & Young in New York. And so I'm curious, just like, when I heard that, it just kind of deconstructed my entire sort of lens of who you were, because it was so unexpected. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, how does one go from, in college you worked, I think, as a bartender. You've modeled quite a bit. You became a CPA and then worked for one of the big four consulting firms. And now you're talking about mushrooms and death. And that, to me, for the same person to have all three of those kind of aspects or elements of them is like, I've never heard of anything like that before. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit more about your story of like, how do you go from, a sorority girl bartending at Florida State to working at the overlap of psychedelics, entrepreneurship and wellness. That's just a fascinating trajectory.
My answer is like, I'm not sure. How did that happen? Yeah, I love this question. I mean, I my family is like, what is going on? Where is she now? You know, I was born in St. Louis. So I was born in the middle of the country with a very different view of the world that I was surrounded with than how I see the world now. And I see so much value in that process because it's given me such a wide aperture of humans. Like all of those things that you described have given me a deep appreciation and respect for all of these different industries. And I feel like I've kind of inserted myself enough and all of them to adopt more compassion for the full experience of you know, what it means to be human through dabbling in all of these different things. And it's not like I've even done that close to extensively, but you know, my path, like if I were to just draw a line through it and explain it through my perspective is I Googled number one party school in America. I was a huge partier. And it came up with Florida State, and I was like, perfect, no consideration for what the academic protocol was going to be there. And I went to Florida State. I became a bartender, and I loved it. I loved hosting parties. I loved community. The through line of all of these things is I've always loved hosting things and bringing people together. So that's a huge part of my life. In the last 2 years, I think I've done around 60 something events, whether it's personal events or dinners or community events through SuperMush, parties through Microdosing Collective, panels, all these things. And I find that it's like the core heartbeat of everything. And so it really keeps me creatively inspired. But I went to Florida State. I had many different aspirations. I was actually originally going to be a sex therapist.
Okay.
So that was,
fits.
Yep. So I studied human sexuality, and then they took away the major as like they converted it to a minor. So I wasn't able to do human sexuality. And I was like, what else is interesting? And I was always really good at school. So I kind of tested out of these classes, and I had a lot of freedom within my academic path. And then I decided I was going to join the Peace Corps. And then for whatever reason, I went on a little bit of a rabbit hole to really look at what is the thing that I could do that would give me the biggest impact. And I ended up deciding that I wanted to make a lot of money, and realizing that the Peace Corps wouldn't necessarily do that for me. I decided to get a major in accounting and marketing. So I got a double major. And then I went to grad school immediately after undergrad. And that year took me on my spiritual journey, or the start of it, where I decided to get my CPA and my master's in accounting. So random, and such a different path from what I had just been doing the prior 4 years, which was bartending, 4 to 5 nights a week for hundreds and hundreds of people. I still see people in Venice. They're like, did you bartend at Florida State? Not like, do you do SuperMush? Like, did you? I think you've poured me like mini Red Bull vodkas, and I'm with my team, and I'm like, oh, good God. But I, really took my body and my mind and my soul very seriously during that year. And it's what birthed my passion for psychedelics, because I had used mushrooms in college with my friends, and it was a beautiful experience, but I still thought that they fried your brain.
Right.
So I had, I grew up with the DARE program. So I was like, this is amazing. Let me make sure I remember this experience. I want to think like this all the time, but not have to use this substance to do it, before I understood that mushrooms are incredible for your brain when used consciously. And yeah, so then from that year, I went to go work in corporate. I worked in corporate America for Ernst & Young. I did consulting. I had a whole wild journey there, loved my job, and then very quickly rose the ranks of that organization and got a lot of really high-paying startup job offers, and then decided I was going to start my own company because I was very passionate about the healthcare system. I was on a lot of different pharmaceuticals growing up for stomach issues I've had since I was a baby. And so during that year, I became my own citizen doctor during that year of grad school. Got off all my medications. I felt amazing. Sober, no alcohol, no caffeine, nothing. And what I like to talk about a lot now is that was amazing. But I didn't realize there is this whole smorgasbord of things that you can alter your consciousness with that can make you a better person and make you more connected and more focused. Hence, the world of psychedelics and all the work that we're doing now. But I went into corporate, decided to say no to those startup job offers, started my first wellness company, like a Birchbox for wellness type thing. And then I started modeling on the side. So for a while I had this triple life where I was like corporate America, had my heels, running to casting calls, like doing fashion weeks. And it was before I was on Instagram, so no one knew about this. But it gave me such a wide variety of experience within one day. Because in one aspect, I would be engaging with someone and they would kind of respect me for my brain. And then in the fashion industry, it was all about the way that I looked. And then in the startup world, it was a totally different culture as well. So really interesting. And during that whole time, I started hosting a lot of events, always very social, always meeting a lot of people. And I think, the through line is community, but my passion was always like, how do I push the extremity of how to live? How do I collect all these experiences? And I quit my modeling career, if you will, my miniature career, when right after a sound journey, where I realized I was like, this is cool and it's provided me a lot of experience, but it's not the thing that I want to spend all of my time doing and give to the world on a more permanent basis. And yeah, really working with psychedelics changed the way that I looked at everything so profoundly. In addition to that, functional mushrooms were a huge part of my wellness journey. So lion's mane and cordyceps. And so I became so obsessed and fascinated with fungi and why no one was talking about them that I literally dropped everything and started, the whole little ecosystem of what we're doing now with SuperMush and Into the Multiverse and Microdosing Collective.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about SuperMush and Into the Multiverse. Like, just so our listeners have a little bit more context about what is it that you are doing? Like, what is SuperMush? What is Into the Multiverse? How do those two sort of work together? And how has it been as an entrepreneur, raising capital? The branding and marketing that you all have is super sexy and fun and very different than any basically other functional mushroom brand that's out there today. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what SuperMush is and sort of the sort of brass tacks of what you're building as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, so SuperMush was born from this idea that we wanted to create, my co-founder and I, Brian, who's amazing, very successful tech entrepreneur. And he had built and sold a company and we had met at a retreat. I read his book. I was like, this person's brilliant. I want him to start a company with me. And we were ideating on what is needed in the mushroom space. And there's a lot of things that happen in between then and now. But basically we wanted to create something that was inspired by the 60s and 70s, that pulled on the culture and the music and the artists and the song lyrics and all of the iconic nature of that era, but pull it into a functional mushroom brand and make something that was focused on Gen Z, millennials, fun, young branding in the space where there wasn't a lot of that. Now there's a little bit more, and really build the Red Bull of mushrooms. And so the way that we've approached SuperMush is it's now this, mental health lifestyle brand. And we have supplements. We make supplements at the core. We make mushroom gummies are our main product, energy, sex, and sleep. Really fun to market the sex gummies on the internet. And then we have, a merch line and we do a ton of community events. So it's really this community-based brand. And we also wanted to focus on education. So we started a podcast about psychedelics and mental health, which is called Into the Multiverse, SuperMush's podcast. And then started really inserting ourselves into the psychedelic space. So, I early on started to do thought leader dinners with leaders in the psychedelic industry because I was so passionate about moving it forward and being a part of that, which has ended up what birthed into Microdosing Collective and everything that we're doing now. And really the mission with SuperMush is how can we help people get off of pharmaceuticals and put their brains and bodies back into balance using the power of functional mushrooms. And so psychedelics get a lot of the sexy airtime in culture because of their nature and stigma. But if the whole world were to just put their brain on lion's mane or learn about chaga and reishi, it would be such a better planet because the functional mushrooms are so impactful. And Paul Stamets has done an amazing job, and other leaders like him, of educating the world on the power of turkey tail and all these other non-psychedelic functional superfoods that you can find at the grocery store. But there's so much power just in those. So we wanted SuperMush to stay fully functional, legal, educate people on the power of fungi holistically, and then also be attached to helping to move the policy world forward. So that's really the mission of it. And we're really investing more into the media side of what we're doing, content, education. We partner with a lot of artists. So we've done things with Soapy Tucker and the Knox and Blondish, and we have all these cool collaborations that we're doing with artists to really merge the gap between culture and music and mushrooms.
All right, let's talk about the Microdosing Collective now, because it builds on all of these aspects and elements that we've been discussing. And even as you were sharing your story, like born in St. Louis, Midwest, raised in a very different environment than what we live in now. I think, an interesting reflection that I've shared with our team at the Microdosing Collective is that we're all from the Midwest. And we have similar but still different upbringings. I think Josh Capel, so Josh is our other co-founder, was born in Omaha. I forget where John is from.
He's from Missouri too.
He's from Missouri as well. So John Downs is also from Missouri. I'm from Michigan. And we've all taken these very different paths out of that environment. And I think it's really inspired all of us to ask the difficult questions about how do we take microdosing or help amplify microdosing outside of, let's say, the Venice or San Francisco Bay Area culture or Brooklyn, Williamsburg subculture, and really get it into a way where it can help people everywhere, not just on the coasts necessarily. And the policy, the regulatory environment is very difficult for this, which I want to talk a little bit about why that is and what we're doing to address that. But where I'd love to start is, why did you want to do this? Because I remember we were at the Butcher's Daughter. It was October 2021. We were with another friend and you pitched us on this. And she was like, I got a lot going on, so I love the idea. I'll support you, but didn't necessarily get involved. And I was like, I'd love to do this. And if we do this, it will be not only a commitment, but also something that will take potentially years to really see the outcome of. And you were not fazed by that whatsoever. And so I'd love to hear why did you come up with that initial idea? What was behind the sort of inspiration for it? And talking just a little bit about how has it evolved since the sort of birth of the idea a few years ago now.
Yeah. On one hand, I had no idea how policy worked.
Right. So there was like a naivete, which I think you need to be that mavericky in working with psychedelics and microdosing,
Yeah. So I say that somewhat for comedic effect, but also it's very true. And I think microdosing had changed my life so profoundly. And it felt so obvious to me that someone would be working on this. So the concept that I came up with, I was like, oh, I can't wait to find the group that's focusing on microdosing legalization and going to put this forward and to legalizing consumer products and people like me being able to have access to this kind of a tool. And there was no one doing it. All of the policy, I remember I was at a conference and I was reading Measure 109. I was on the internet reading the measure and the details around it. And I was like, oh, all of this is around macrodosing at service centers and very high-priced, high-dose trips. And I was like, well, where does microdosing fit into this equation? Because it's such a powerful practice. I'd been working with people, hearing their stories of profound transformation with microdosing for years, and really noticing its effect on my life, which we can talk about in a little bit. But just to stay on this thread, and it was nowhere. And there was incredible educators in the space, like yourself and Third Wave, that had mainstreamed the knowledge on the back end of, James Fadiman and these incredible educational, cultural movements. But there was a complete gap between culture and government.
Right.
All of the attention, and it's a really interesting time we can talk about now of like, what does the policy look like? We'll get into that, but all of the attention was on macrodosing service centers. And when I talked to you, I was like, there needs to be someone advocating for this, educating, bringing together all of the people that cared about microdosing. And the other massive thing to note, our friend Bradley Hicks said this to me at the dinner that we hosted in LA a few months ago. He's like, we're legalizing the whole bottle of wine before we legalize a sip.
Right.
And I do think that that really puts into perspective, microdosing can be so impactful. It's relatively low risk in comparison, inexpensive, massively impactful. And there's such a necessity to help people take care of their mental health using this practice. So the idea was, how do we create a group of people that's focused on community building in this space, research, because the research was very sparse. There's more things coming out now. It's still very sparse. Invest into that, prove the efficacy of microdosing there, and then also work on policy initiatives that could actually bring people together and make sure that microdosing is included in the legislative frameworks as we're proposing these big, massive bills that will help people that want to take a macrodose. So there's that, right? And then the other side of it is, at the time we talked, this was not even necessarily an issue, at least not, it hadn't made its way to PR yet, or our groups. Mm-hmm. But as this movement has mainstreamed and you're getting these press hits of microdosing changed my life from prominent figures in the world, the underground market is exploded.
Right.
And there's, thousands, you obviously can't accurately count, but thousands of underground products. Many of them are incredible. And then many of them are completely full of not microdosing. So there's a lot of sketchiness and, people buying unregulated products. And that's actually now proven to be not safe. There's this whole diamond shrooms thing, which we can get into as well. Like, companies are putting toxins in their product and they're making people sick. And when we're engaging with something we want to take for our mental health, it should be regulated, it should be safe, you should know what's in it. And so really our work is to help make that accessible. You and I have access to the best microdosing products, I believe, that are out there. It's not about that. And it's not about just helping the underground companies grow and have more access. It's about closing the gap, to bring back to your original point of where we're from. I want my family in Missouri to be able to have safe access to these products if they want to take care of their mental health in a different way and not have to turn to pharmaceuticals.
Right. I have a brother-in-law who's a war vet. He served in Afghanistan. And so when he came back, he had been struggling with some severe mental health issues. And because we're quite close, I've been able to help support him on that journey to, get off some of these psychiatric medications and start to microdose. And it's really, really helped him. And he was, this is a slight tangent, but he was crestfallen about the news around MDMA being rejected by the FDA because not only has he struggled with PTSD, but a lot of the people that he knows have also struggled with PTSD. And I think that also hits on one thing that you've touched on, which is we have a mental health crisis. The psychiatric medications, most commonly Prozac, Zoloft, and Lexapro, the classic SSRIs, are simply ineffective for the majority of people and yet highly addictive with a bunch of nasty side effects. And so people are now having to break the law and put themselves at risk, both legally but also physiologically, because a lot of these products, not a lot, some of these products don't necessarily have psilocybin in them. Some, it's quite innocent, I would say. They have 4-ACO-DMT, which is a psilocybin analog and perfectly safe. But we've also seen this case with diamond shrooms, which has been getting a lot of media attention lately, where they put Amanita muscaria in the chocolates, which is not anything like psilocybin. And if you take Amanita without it being properly metabolized or processed, it creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of sickness, it's toxic, basically, to put in your body, which is the exact opposite of what psilocybin is meant to do. So I think speaking really to the importance of consumer protection, right? Like we've emphasized that the underground market for chocolates and microdosing supplements, it's probably minimum $100 million. It's probably closer to $300 to $400 to $500 million in terms of what's happening. I shared a stat on social, and I know I've shared with you as well, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms in 2023 in the United States. 4 million of those people were microdosing with psilocybin mushrooms. And we are the only organization that is advocating for this grassroots movement. And so we've even talked about, I remember we were up in the policy conversation with California, which I want to get into next, because I think it'll provide an interesting window into some of the aspects that are going on. And I was talking with Josh, and he was like, we really are a movement for the people, like truly. MAPS has positioned themselves that way, but they've really been focused on medicalization of MDMA up until this recent rejection, where they're really shifting to more to decrim. But very few people are advocating for the biggest populace of psychedelic users, which are those who are microdosing psilocybin mushrooms. And we need it. It's so essential that we need it. And so we went to California, we went to Sacramento. We were the first organization to hire a microdosing lobbyist, Anthony Molina and his crew, and they've been fantastic in supporting us and working with us. And I'd love to hear your take on Sacramento and talking with policymakers and talking with the governor's office. What was it like to be in those halls? What was it like to have those conversations? And what were some of your impressions of speaking with politicians about the potential of microdosing?
Yeah, it was one of the most interesting things I think, I've ever done, because it really painted a picture for me that most of the things that we're really frustrated about are born from naivete versus ill will.
Right. And
there is this hilarity where the people that are making policy and writing legislature around what we are altering our consciousness with have no idea often what those substances are. And that part's almost comical in a way, because it would be like someone, giving you tax advice that is a bartender. Right. That doesn't, we have such a gap, and there's like such an educational barrier. And so in a lot of ways, I expected to go in and be kind of fighting against informed opinion, or, not fighting is the wrong word, debating against informed opinion around the the negative potential effects of psychedelics, which there are very real potential negative experiences that people can have, and
which are mostly mitigated by microdosing, I will say, which is why we've talked about it and emphasized it.
Exactly. But people can have psychotic breaks after high dose experiences, and we communicated a lot with people that are very concerned about that, and we're sharing why microdosing is a potential anecdote to that. But it was really an amazing experience, because a lot of people within Sacramento are actually potentially eager and excited about this practice. Everyone wants better mental health, and they want people to have these solutions, but it really is just showing the safety and explaining the history and explaining how it affects your brain chemistry, and it's just education. So it was a really cool experience. It kind of felt similar to Sorority Rush, because we had, 12 meetings in one day, and we're going back to back, met some amazing people that will be incredible advocates. But it really diffused for me, I guess, the understanding that it diffused this gap of the culture's going one way, but the real work is to go in and educate people that are writing these policies if you want to have wide-reaching impact. So the stuff that we're doing, and community building and research and all of that, it's really impactful then to take that body of work and go advocate, which is now what we're looking at doing, right, with a potential ballot measure in California. There's so many questions around how that comes to light, because there's so many unknowns. I mean, if you just look at MAPS and what Rick intended to have happen, it felt like an absolute. I mean,
it felt like a shoo-in, for sure.
Like a shoo-in. And he sat here on exactly where you're sitting, and we talked about the future of what this would look like upon an FDA approval at this time. And that ended up not happening, which shows a deeper system issue. What we're proposing doing is also working with that system, but given your point of for the people. We want to go to the people to make the decision, hence a ballot measure, which would allow people to actually vote on whether they're allowed to consume these things.
Yeah, and one conversation that I've continually had over the last 10 years as I've been advocating for microdosing very publicly is research is important, and there is a dearth of research. We do need more clinical research on the efficacy of microdosing, and there are a couple biotech companies, including Paul Stamets' company, Mycomedica, Mind Biotherapeutics, that are doing clinical trials with these microdoses of both LSD and also the Stamets stack, which is psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin. And what I've talked about since 2016, 2017 is the everyday person who is suffering, who's looking for something that actually works. Most of them don't really care so much about what the clinical research says. Most of them are swayed by the stories of friends and family members of theirs that have themselves tried microdosing, have been positively supported, and they're willing to go that route because they know that, oh, if it helped this person who had been struggling with X, Y, and Z for so long, maybe it'll also be possible to help me. And the reason I say that is because policy and regulation is certainly important, right? I remember there was some research published in the last few months that said when Oregon legalized psilocybin and Colorado legalized the natural medicines through the Natural Medicine Health Acts, there was a massive bump in Google searches in those states for psychedelics. So no doubt policy matters, and people aren't going to wait for policy. And the longer policymakers wait to actually do something about this, the more risk there is for consumer protections, like we're seeing with this whole Diamond Shrooms fiasco. And I would say it's both, it's on the one hand incredibly frustrating to even go to a place like Sacramento and talk to, you know, the governor's office and certain senators and representatives and realize they really have very little clue about microdosing in particular. Some of them knew about the psychedelic research, you know, MDMA for PTSD, but very few knew actually about microdosing. So on the one hand, it's very frustrating. On the other hand, it does present, I think, an opportunity to really have a massive impact. And that massive impact is it's really hard earned, as Rick experiences and has been experiencing with MDMA for MAPS. It's not guaranteed, and that at times can feel a bit depressing. Isn't the right word, but like, what's the point? And so I'd be curious, just as like, to hear your thoughts on this. Let's say it still takes another 6 or 7 years, right, to really make this happen. For you, what will continue to motivate you and inspire you to like continue to push this movement forward through the Microdosing Collective, even if it's a situation like what Rick has experienced with MAPS, where it's like you do everything correctly? I mean, MAPS even worked with the FDA to design their clinical trials, and then the FDA moved the goalposts and changed it. How do you sort of think about that potential when it comes to the work that we're doing with the Microdosing Collective and generally with psychedelics?
Yeah, I had this conversation with someone who is working in the underground market, and he was like, "What's the point? Why don't you just, you know, either work in that space or push that? What is the point? I'm not engaging with the government because, you know, F the government kind of mentality." And I guess the North Star of this being, right, if we had to paint a picture of what this looks like, I actually recently wrote a future letter to myself, and this was included in there. It was, you know, SuperMush related, and Microdosing Collective was in there. But what a beautiful world it would look like if in California we were able to legalize microdosing psilocybin and allow people to have access to that subtle neuroplasticity in their day-to-day life, and what that would create as a cultural movement for the rest of the country. And so I think when I think about my own motivation or why I think what we're doing is so important, you know, why start a nonprofit and as a kind of pro bono project when we have all these other things going on, I really feel it's the glue to tie together this mission. And, you know, to my earlier point, if you were to look at a world with more open-minded people, or, you know, with more ability to connect, even in a subtle way. Often the subtlety is even more impactful.
Right.
Because you're slightly neuroplastic while you're in your day-to-day life. And the example I like to paint, or that I'm kind of working with and using right now, is, you know, the scene in The Matrix where all the bullets are flying at Neo.
Sure.
And they, you know, all the bullets freeze in front of him, and he's able to pick them up and look at them and then decide to move them to the side and take a different course, so to speak. Imagine what a world would look like if people were to have access to that kind of a reaction, because so much of what we're seeing on the internet right now with all of the issues that are going on in the world is this immediate reaction. And I still catch myself in this stuff all the time. You know, the classic example of when your mom says something annoying to you on the phone and you're like, Mom, and you return to a 10-year-old version of yourself.
Yeah.
Microdosing has really helped me with taking a step back and looking at my decisions and live pattern interrupting myself. And so I think it would be a much more beautiful world if we were to have that accessible on a large scale. I think that what we're doing is absolutely one of the best paths to get us there, because the quickest way to put people in a slightly neuroplastic state is to give them a microdose of psilocybin or perhaps something else. But the point is, I see the future of how impactful it could be.
Well, and what you're speaking to is that space between, right? And the capacity to respond rather than react. And when people start to microdose, they notice they have that ability to not, like you said, get stuck in the same patterns, to step out of that without it feeling like such an effort. And that's not to say high doses of psychedelics aren't beautifully profound and life-changing, but those have a particular context and intention. And in some ways, and it's why we're even doing what we're doing, comparing high doses of psychedelics, it's like apples to oranges with microdosing, because the context in which we microdose is different. Oftentimes the intentions for why we microdose are different. The day-to-day that we, how we weave microdosing into our day-to-day is much different than after we have a profound mystical experience with high doses of psychedelics. And it does bring me back even to the beginning of our conversation about this sort of this relationship between death and life, you know, that if we're choosing to live and we're choosing to be part of this existence, even if it takes way longer than anticipated, the North Star is compelling enough that why not? Like, for me, it's almost like, why not continue to show up and devote ourselves to that? Because I also feel like so much of living a meaningful life is being in service to something beyond ourselves. And so when that is the call, then it almost is like a no-brainer just to continue to do it. I remember I was at Stan Groff like holotropic breathwork workshop. This is about 5 years ago in San Francisco, and it was a few months after he had a stroke. And he was there present. He was having a hard time communicating, but he was there present. He was on the floor as people were in breath work, you know, helping them out. And we had a bit of a Q&A session afterwards. And I asked him, I'm like, look, Stan, you were in the Czech Republic working with LSD when that became illegal. So you moved to the United States and literally invented holotropic breath work to do that. You've just had a stroke 3 months ago. And here you are on the floor helping people, you know, with like, why do you do this? And he basically said, I can't not. And so when we have this sort of calling or vocation or just something deeper that's moving through, the place that I always land, it's like, this isn't my choice necessarily, right? There's sort of this greater even intelligence, and maybe it's the mushroom intelligence, right, that's moving through, or a lot of my experiences with LSD have been that way. That's sort of compelling me to continue to show up and fight or stand up for or make an impact for people who are not as, I would say, lucky as we are to be totally in this vibe, if you will, with access to the best microdoses. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that, because I think it's, that to me is like a compelling enough reason, and it's intimidating at times. And if you think about it, if even if when I get ahead of myself, right, like I'm like, I've been in this space for 9 years and we've seen a lot of substantial changes, but also not much has really changed yet. And it's almost like having that vision of what could be possible in 40 years rather than what's possible in the next like 1 to 2 years is a really great way to sort of think about this.
Yeah. That exact thing you just painted, that feeling of I can't not, because something else, a bigger life force is moving through me. I have seen, at least in my personal experience, that I have way more access to that feeling post psychedelics.
Right.
It's like a unlock. And so that, I keep using the word neuroplasticity or plasticity within your brain, the ability to be flexible, to think in new ways. Psychedelics gives people at such a profound rate. And I think if more people were to have that moving through them, that service modality, that less individualistic, let me accumulate, more like Stan Grof, let me dedicate my life to service despite my circumstance, versus individualistic, let me, in a lot of the Western way of being is how do I accumulate enough for myself to protect myself and my family. And then we have this massive gap. Rick said this really beautifully, Rick Doblin on the podcast, that we don't have a resource problem. We have an empathy problem.
Right.
And microdosing and, these other subtle neuroplasticity techniques, whether it be breath work or meditation, whatever it may be, helps to rebalance the empathy in our own psyches and then our own families and then our own communities. So it's really just a trickle effect. And I think you made a really beautiful point around the thing that's the most impactful. We can sit there till we're blue in the face and talk to policymakers about the science and the research, but the conversations I had that were the most impactful were sharing my own experience, or also sharing that my dad started to enjoy his life in a way I've never experienced towards the end of his life because he was microdosing. I've seen people on the back end of grief be able to find a desire to live and still want to be on the planet because of access to this as a tool. And the mental health of humans that are wanting to end their life often do find reprieve in tools like this. I've seen it in my own personal world. And those are the things that really move the needle. So we want to move all the research forward and all of that stuff as well. But at the end of the day, if you're sitting and talking to a policymaker that's a mother and you explain to them that your mother, still wants to be on the planet because of access to psychedelics, it resonates in a different way because you can see yourself in that person's experience.
Right.
So what I'd love for us to do as an organization is also still stay so committed to the stories and our own personal whys behind it. Like even as I'm talking about it and sharing it, it recommits me to, the why behind all of this.
Right.
And the motivation to keep doing things,
And so I'd love to end with just, there's a lot of folks listening to this. We've talked a little bit about the Microdosing Collective through Third Wave, but this is the real sort of first full-length podcast that we've done dedicated to it. So for, anyone who's listening, for practitioners, for coaches, for doctors, for just microdosers who are actively, working with psychedelics and it's helping to support them, if they want to support our mission with the Microdosing Collective, if they want to get behind us, if they want to contribute to this larger movement, how can they do that? Like what would you say would be the best way to get involved and support what it is that we're doing with the Microdosing Collective?
So over the last 3 years, we've had around 70 companies come in and fund the organization. I like to kind of paint a picture of what our community looks like and then where we see it going. So we've had 70 companies. It's, founders of wellness companies, fully legal supplement companies, a few tech companies in the psychedelic space that have come in to support this movement. And then we also have this entire community of individuals. Part of it lives on a WhatsApp group chat for now. We're working on building a larger community platform and kind of education portal for people to have access to not only the policy, but the education around microdosing, all the things that we're doing. So we're in the process of building that house even further. But for people that want to get involved in what we're doing, depends on if you're listening, if you're a company, we have memberships available where you can support us financially and then be involved in these conversations, be involved in our policy initiatives, our North Star right now is how do we create a ballot initiative in California, working with our lobbyist, Anthony, and these other policymakers. So all hands on deck. We want as much help as we can get with that. And then as a community member, we have, the availability for you to sign up. It's $10 a month for you to be a member of what we're doing, have access to the latest news articles and the policy stuff and the research, and then also all of our community events. So one of the things that you and I are doing, and I'm excited about doing more of, is these community panels. We're doing an event at Soho House in Austin in about a month, and sharing more of that education. But at baseline, go to microdosingcollective.org/donate if you want to be involved officially. And I always tell everyone, reach out to us if you want to support with events or with anything else that we're working on. The dream state is that we combine with other organizations to pull together, instead of everyone working on an individual policy thing in their silos, we pull together the massive organizations that are funding psychedelics right now, that are funding research, all into one group that we can then make the most effective, compelling narrative for passing something and pulling and making this above ground and making it legal.
So that's microdosingcollective.org/donate. If you want to learn more about Alli or just tune into what she's up to, Alli Schaper.
Alli Schaper.
On Instagram.
Very active on Instagram.
SCHAPER. She has a fantastic podcast, Into the Multiverse. I was a guest a couple of years ago. So if you want to even check out the podcast that we did together, that's Into the Multiverse. And then SuperMush.com.
SuperMush.com.
SuperMush.com is where you can check out the sex, energy, and what was the third gummy? Sleep gummies. The sex ones are great, I have to say. I need to get a few more of those. Strawberry champagne? Is that the... Strawberry
champagne, sugar-free, superfood gummies. They're the
all
best.
Healthy. They're cute. The packaging's beautiful. So check out supermush.com. Any other places? Microdosingcollective.org, Alli Schaper on Instagram, supermush.com, Into the Multiverse podcast.
That's the main thing. I'm really active on Instagram. I'm very accessible there. So my Instagram's Alli Schaper, and everything that I do is linked under my Instagram. So if this was inspiring to you, definitely reach out to me. And I would love people to try SuperMush. I always love hearing people's reviews and what they think. When you sell sex gummies on the internet, you hear you're a portal for a lot of interesting stories.
I imagine.
But I'm really excited about everything and everything we're doing together. So thank you for finally having me on your show.
You're welcome, Alli Schaper.
This is a major life moment for me. Now I might have lost my motivation. This is really what I wanted.
This is it.
This is what I wanted.
Why am I going to keep working with Paul? It's not worth all the hassle. I get it. Yeah.
This is nirvana.
Totally. Well, Alli, it's been great to have you. Thank you for coming on. It's an honor to do this work with you. It's an honor to help with the Microdosing Collective and be part of that. And most importantly, it's really been beautiful to be your friend. So I appreciate you and everything that we get to do together.
I love you so much. You were early inspiration for me to do any of these things. So Third Wave and all of the work that you've done was the original inspiration for a lot of this. And then I stalked you into starting a nonprofit with me. So I'm so grateful and I'm really excited. And thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you, Alli. Hey, folks, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you want to go deeper, check out the show notes. Go to community.thethirdwave.co, our free community platform, and leave us a review on iTunes or Spotify. If you enjoyed this, if you thought it was interesting, if you thought someone might benefit from it, leave us a review, share it with a friend or family member. Help us spread the word, especially about the Microdosing Collective. And that's the final thing. If you want to support the Microdosing Collective, go to microdosingcollective.org. We are a 501c3. Every donation is tax deductible. Thank you so much for your support, for your continued listening to the Psychedelic Podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.